In 1994, a decorated homicide detective named Ray Skelton closed 47 cases in under 6 years, a record in his department. Nobody questioned how he did it. Nobody connected the dots until now. Here is what actually happened. Ray Skelton spent the better part of a decade hunting one of the most elusive killers his county had ever seen. He was obsessive. He was brilliant. He was the guy they called when nobody else could crack it. Then one morning in March of 2001, his own captain slid a manila folder across the table. Inside were photographs, evidence logs, witness statements. Every single piece pointed directly at Ray himself, the man who built the case, the man who chased the killer. Suddenly became the prime suspect. And what nobody in that room knew, what the entire investigation missed, is that someone had been building that frame for years, piece by piece, in the shadows. While Ray was looking the other way, stay with me, because this story goes somewhere most true crime cases never go. You might be thinking, okay, another wrongful accusation story happens all the time, except this one is different, and the reason it matters to you right now is because this case exposes something deeply broken about how evidence can be manufactured, how trust inside institutions gets weaponized, and how the one person closest to the truth becomes the easiest person to destroy. Ray Skelton did not just lose his job. He lost his marriage. He lost his pension. He lost 7 years of his life fighting a system that had already decided he was guilty before a single jury was seated. And the mechanism that was used to frame him— Let's start with what the official record says. The case Ray had been working was the murder of a 34-year-old accountant named Dennis Hale, found in a drainage canal outside Millbrook County in September of 1997. No weapon, no witnesses, barely any forensic evidence. It was the kind of case that broke careers. Ray took it personally. He logged over 800 hours on that single investigation across 4 years. He interviewed 112 individuals. He requested 6 separate forensic re-examinations. His colleagues called him obsessed. His captain called it dedication. Then, in late 2000, Ray started getting close. He had narrowed his suspect list to 3 individuals, all with connections to the county's real estate development board, men with money, men with reach, men who had everything to lose if Ray kept pulling threads. And here is where the surface story ends and the real story begins. Because within 90 days of Ray submitting that suspect shortlist, 90 days, his own personal firearm was found at a secondary crime scene, a scene he had never been assigned to, a scene nobody could explain why he would visit. Officially, that was the moment the investigation turned inward. Unofficially, someone had been planning this for a very long time. Here is what the official investigation never seriously pursued. The 3 men Ray had flagged, Thomas Verrill, a commercial developer, Gary Prynn, a county contracts administrator, and a third individual whose name was redacted from all publicly released documents, had a documented relationship with 2 officers inside Ray's own precinct. Not a casual relationship, a financial one, property transfers, private LLC memberships, shell company signatures that only surfaced years later through a parallel civil investigation. But in 2001, none of that was on the table. What was on the table was Ray's fingerprint on a shell casing, a casing recovered from a scene he had no assignment to. Now here is where most people stop. They see fingerprint evidence, and they accept the narrative. But Ray's defense attorney, a former federal prosecutor named Linda Castillo, noticed something that changed everything. The chain of custody log for that casing had a 14-hour gap. 14 hours where that piece of evidence was signed out, unmonitored, by a civilian evidence technician who had since transferred out of the department. A technician who, it later emerged, had financial ties to one of the 3 men Ray had flagged. One thread. That is all it took to start unraveling the entire frame. But pulling that thread required resources. It required secrecy, and it required Ray to do something that nobody inside that department could ever find out about. Let's talk about the root of this. Because this was not random. It was not opportunistic. What happened to Ray Skelton was a calculated, multi-year operation to neutralize a threat. The 3 men he had identified were connected to a land acquisition scheme that had been quietly running through Millbrook County since the early 1990s. Dennis Hale, the original victim, had been the accountant who processed those transactions. He had found the irregularities. He had kept copies. And when he was killed, those copies disappeared. Ray got close enough to figure out that Hale had not just been murdered, he had been silenced. And the moment Ray filed that internal suspect memo in November 2000, he signed his own professional death warrant. The people behind the original murder had infrastructure inside the department. They had an inside contact. They had the ability to move evidence, redirect forensic requests, and manufacture a paper trail that would take years to untangle. This was not a crime of passion. This was institutional corruption operating at a level that most people refuse to believe exists. Because believing it means accepting that the system you trust to protect you can be turned against someone just as easily. And that is the part that should genuinely unsettle you. Most coverage of this case, and there has been some buried in regional legal journals and one investigative podcast from 2018, focuses entirely on the wrongful prosecution angle, the mishandled evidence, the biased investigation, the eventual exoneration. But here is what everyone misses: the thing that actually saved Ray. Ray Skelton, operating alone, stripped of his badge, under active investigation, managed to build a private evidence file that his own legal team used to dismantle the frame, and he did it without the department knowing. How? He could not use department systems. Every digital move he made on official hardware was logged and monitored. So Ray went private. He used a personal laptop. He used encrypted communications with a handful of former colleagues who still believed him. And critically, he used a VPN to conduct his research, access archived public records, contact journalists, and communicate with Linda Castillo without his internet activity being traceable back to him or his home address. This is not a minor detail. This is the reason the case turned. Because without that layer of privacy, every search Ray ran, every document he pulled, every source he contacted would have been visible to the very people trying to bury him. The VPN, here is everything assembled. Ray's private investigation, conducted over 11 months while he was technically suspended pending trial, produced 4 critical pieces of evidence. First, he located the transferred evidence technician, a man named Carl Weiss, living in a different state under a slightly altered name. Weiss had been paid. Ray documented the financial transaction through archived LLC records he accessed using anonymized searches. Second, Ray tracked down a former assistant to one of the 3 flagged developers who had kept contemporaneous notes about internal meetings. Notes that referenced Dennis Hale by name months before the murder in the context of a, quote, liability problem. Third, Ray obtained a copy of the original evidence log for the shell casing from a retired clerk who had made a personal backup before leaving the department. That backup showed the 14-hour gap had been logged internally but never flagged, suggesting someone above the floor level had deliberately buried it. And fourth, the clearest evidence of all, Ray found a second set of fingerprints on the casing that had never been processed. Prints that belonged to Carl Weiss. In February 2003, Ray's attorney presented this consolidated private file to a federal oversight board. The case against Ray was formally dropped in April of that year. 3 individuals were subsequently investigated. 2 were indicted. The third, the redacted name, was never publicly charged. The Dennis Hale murder has never been officially solved, but the people who tried to make Ray Skelton disappear into the system he served, they did not entirely escape. So what do you actually do with this story? Because if you have watched this far, you already know it is not just about Ray. It is about how evidence works, how institutions can be corrupted from the inside, how the person with the most to lose is often the one least equipped to defend themselves when the system turns on them. The lesson from Ray Skelton's case is this: when the infrastructure meant to protect you becomes the threat, your only defense is information, private, documented, verifiable information that exists outside the channels your adversaries control. Ray survived because he understood that early enough. He protected his research. He protected his communications. He built his case quietly, methodically, in the dark, the same way his enemies had built the frame against him. And he won. Not because the system corrected itself, but because he refused to let the system be the only voice in the room. If this story resonated with you, share it with someone who thinks institutional corruption is a conspiracy theory. Because Ray Skelton is not a conspiracy theory. He is a court record. He is a federal exoneration filing. He is a man who spent 7 years proving that the truth, protected and pursued correctly, eventually surfaces. Subscribe to Dark Files if you want more cases like this, because there are more, a lot more, and they do not always end the way Ray's did. Before you go, drop a comment below with one word. Just one word that describes how this case made you feel. I read every single one, and if you want to go deeper on cases where law enforcement itself becomes the crime scene, hit the playlist linked right here. New cases drop every Tuesday. Do not miss the next one. Disclaimer. This video discusses real events for educational purposes. All persons are presumed innocent until proven guilty.